find today's webinar on cultural safety, helpful to your community health nursing practice. Today I'm going to address three main concepts that I feel are essential to working with Aboriginal clients and communities. They are cultural safety, intergenerational trauma, and relational practice. Local and national Aboriginal service groups such as the CHNIG of Toronto, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, and the Aboriginal Nurses Association of Canada tell us that in order for healthcare professionals to provide quality, culturally safe care for Aboriginal clients, health professionals need preparation on the following topics: Aboriginal worldviews, impacts of colonization, determinants of health, and health outcomes for Aboriginal people, barriers to health services access, and gaps in mainstream health services. Also, we need to learn about healing in Aboriginal communities. It is these topics that guide our seminar objectives for today. Many of the health science programs in our province have little or no Aboriginal content in their curriculum, and as a result, many community nurses are unfamiliar with this content. Recognizing that this session is just 1 hour in length, I hope that it will inspire you to explore these topics in more depth and reach out to your local Aboriginal communities to learn more. I also have a detailed reference list at the end of the presentation that could also be a source for you to do some more exploring of these topics. Before I proceed, I would like to clarify my use of the terms Aboriginal and Indigenous. In this webinar, my use of the term Aboriginal will conform to that described by the Assembly of First Nations, to refer collectively to the members of the three distinct cultural groups of the First Peoples of Canada: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. The term Aboriginal community, I use that to refer to the often small, rural, and remote villages of Aboriginal people who live on or off reserves, as well as the communities of Aboriginal people in urban centres. The term Indigenous is commonly found in the literature referring to Aboriginal people in international context, and it is similar in meaning with Aboriginal. So we'll start today exploring the concept of cultural safety. The term cultural safety refers to the theory that was created in the late 1980s by the Maori nurse Irapeti Ramsden in response to her people's dissatisfaction with nursing and midwifery care, as well as their negative experiences in the healthcare system in New Zealand. Since that time, cultural safety has been adopted by Indigenous communities and service groups and nursing organizations worldwide as an important alternative to cultural competence. As a concept that has come from an Aboriginal community, cultural safety offers nursing a culturally acceptable and appropriate model for working with Aboriginal people, because it examines power relationships and systemic barriers in healthcare. They can easily be overlooked when using the concept of cultural competence. For those of you who aren't sure about cultural safety or are even critical of it, I hope that this webinar will help you to appreciate the importance and usefulness of the cultural safety model for community health nursing practice. In 2010, cultural safety was recognized by our Canadian Nurses Association in the position statement on cultural competence. And this is a great document that I would encourage you to read if you haven't already done so. Cultural safety, it provides a post-colonial framework to examine the racism and power imbalances, as well as institutional discrimination that marginalize Indigenous people and contribute to unequal healthcare and poor health status globally. The concept of cultural safety encourages us to reflect on our internalized attitudes instead of focusing on the characteristics of the person who is different from us or not of the dominant culture. In my role as a nursing educator, I have found that the cultural safety approach is user-friendly, and it helps us to look at the issue of cultural competence from another angle, because it guides us to look at ourselves and not the person that is different. Another advantage of cultural safety is that it is the client and not the nurse who is meant to evaluate whether or not an interaction has been culturally safe. This helps to restore the power in healthcare interactions back to the client. Cultural safety also views the relationship between clients and nurses as one of equals. And for this reason, this model is also a good fit for community health nursing, as we recognize the importance of partnership with our clients in our standards of practice. When I was in nursing school, we were taught that the path to cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, was by learning about the cultural beliefs and health practices of our clients. When we focus on learning about other cultures in this way, we effectively subordinate our clients in a process of what we call othering. This view of culture does a couple of things. It presents an inaccurate understanding of post-colonial societies. It perpetuates stereotypes by disregarding within-group differences. And it ignores the colonial histories and racialized oppression that have shaped and marginalized many cultures. It also privileges dominant Western culture as normative. Cultural safety urges us to go beyond an interest in pre-contact history and cultural practices. Instead, cultural safety education involves learning about Canada's colonial history. Nurses need knowledge and awareness of the violence of Canadian colonial history and the devastating multi-generational and community impact of the residential school system. Cultural safety education also involves a process of self-discovery, where we identify our conscious and unconscious attitudes in an attempt to transform them. The awareness we garner from cultural safety education allows us to appreciate the gift of generosity as a nurse, of an Aboriginal person's willingness to enter into a relationship with a Western trained health professional. Several authors suggest that we think of cultural safety as part of a continuum with cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and cultural competence. Anishinaabe Health Toronto has linked this continuum with the stages of learning on the medicine wheel. We start in the yellow quadrant with cultural awareness. The yellow quadrant traditionally represents awareness, and in terms of our cultural nursing practice, at this stage we acknowledge difference. Then we move clockwise to the red quadrant, and this traditionally represents the struggle in learning. And it's this where we move to cultural sensitivity, when there is an attitude change and respect of difference. Then we continue on to the black quadrant that traditionally represents skill building, to cultural competence, where we focus on the skills, knowledge, and attitudes of healthcare practitioners. And finally, we move to the white quadrant that traditionally represents the action or doing phase of learning, to cultural safety, which involves education about colonial history and self-reflection. It's this self-reflection that fosters empathy and improves the therapeutic relationship and improves health outcomes. And this is the goal of cultural safety. Cultural safety begins with cultural safety education. And to do this, I'm going to read to you a short story written by an Aboriginal author about a 6-year-old girl who is about to leave for residential school. After that, I will talk about intergenerational trauma, and then we will listen to a CBC radio archive with the voices of Canadian residential school survivors. The story I'm going to read is called CHNIG, which means She Loves to Play in the Water. This book was written in 2005 by Nicola Campbell, who is an Aboriginal author from British Columbia. The story follows the 6-year-old girl CHNIG 4 days before she is taken to residential school. Each day she spends with a member of her family who reminds her of the beauty of her culture, who she is, and most importantly, to never forget. CHNIG has since been made into a short film. It is the first ever film to ever be shot entirely in Hokkien, the language of the Stobo Nation in British Columbia. I'd like to begin by reading a passage from the foreword to the book. The author writes, "For a long time, the Canadian government believed that Native people were uncivilized and made laws forcing Native children as young as 4, to go to residential school to learn European culture and religion. Parents were put in jail if they didn't send their children to these schools. She asks, can you imagine a community without children? Can you imagine children without parents? And now the story. 1, 2, 3, 4 mornings left until I go to school, said Shishi Echo as she watched sunlight dance butterfly steps across her mother's sleeping face. When streams of lights and shadows across her mother's cheeks, she said, Mom, wake up. It's time for us to bathe down by the creek. Her mother blinked. You woke early today, Shishi Echo, she said, swinging her feet to the floor. With the first steps of sunrise, Shishi Echo skipped along the worn path through the cottonwood trees all the way to the creek. My girl, we will not see each other until the wild roses bloom in the spring and the salmon have returned to our river. I want you to remember the ways of our people. I want you to remember our songs and our dances, our laughter and our joy. And I want you to remember our land. Then her mother began to sing. Her voice traveled from tree to tree, flowing through the valley, caught by the wind, carried on the wings of eagles in flight. Shishi Echo could not help herself. She looked at everything. Tall grass swaying to the rhythm of the breeze, determined mosquitoes, working bumblebees. She memorized each shiny rock, the sand beneath her feet, crayfish and minnows and tadpoles that squirmed between her toes, all at the bottom of the creek. They were almost home when cousins, aunties, and uncles, and the rhythmic tap of yayas always cedar cane could be heard through the trees. Mother, father, they're here! Shishi Echo ran to greet her family. Sunlight, wood smoke, and scents of barbecued socknut salmon filled the air. Dishes clattered, footsteps pitter-pattered, and laughter echoed from tree to tree. Afterwards, in the late-night silence, tucked safely under Yaya's patchwork quilt, Shishi Echo counted her fingers. There are only 1, 2, 3 more sleeps until I go to school. In the morning when Shishi Echo woke, the sky was changing navy to brilliant blue. She lay listening to the cool autumn breeze sing morning songs. Soft drum birds. Let's take the canoe out on the lake, said her father. Hand in hand, they walked along the creek all the way to the lake. My girl, these are the things you must always remember, he said, gesturing to the trees, mountains, and water around them. Together, they picked up the canoe and carried it to the water's edge. With the yellow cedar paddles, they strolled across smooth water. Reach, dip, pull back. Reach, dip, pull back. The only sounds they heard were the whistling birds and their paddles breaking the surface of the lake, surrounding them with ripples. Circle on, circle on, circle. Her father sang the paddle song that her grandfather used to sing. His voice traveled across the water, a chant that kept their peace. Shishi Echo could not help herself. She looked at everything. She tasted the rain that fell on her face. She listened as the water washed every rocky beach. And when eagle song echoed through the valley, traveling just beyond reach, she sang her grandfather's paddle song, and their voices echoed from beach to beach. In a day full of sunlight, Shishi Echo and her father returned to pack their things. Finally, in the silence of the night, belly full, huddled safely under Yaya's patchwork quilt, Shishi Echo counted her fingers. 1, 2, only 2 more sleeps, then fell into water-exhausted sleep. Shishi Echo was dreaming when she heard her Yaya say, Shishi Echo, wake up, my girl. We have some things to do today. Yaya gave her a small bag made from soft tan, deer hide, and seaweed. This, my girl, is a bag for you to keep all your memories. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, remember to keep them safe. sun wasn't up yet when they walked out the door and into the trees. The path was dark and smelled alive with rain, wet soil, and weeds. They walked until the sun was shining. Yaya brought her to visit a great big fir tree. Echo placed a sprig into her bag of memories. They visited a hemlock, a cedar, even a pine, and each time she placed a sprig into her bag of memories. They went to visit silver willow, red willow, sagebrush, cottonwood, Labrador bushes, and even conifer. They visited blueberry, salmonberry, saskatoon, and huckleberry bushes. They found bitterroot, wild potato, and wild celery patches. On and on they went through fields of wild roses, Indian paintbrush, firewood, and columbine. Echo promised herself, I will remember everything. Each plant they came to, she listened carefully to its name, then asked once, twice, even 3 times, is it food or medicine, Yaya? Is it always safe? Then whispering its name, she placed dried berry, fruit, flower, and fragrant meat into her bag of memories. That night when Echo crawled under the patchwork quilt, she counted her fingers and said, only one more sleep. At home, the cattle truck with gathered children waited. Echo picked up her bag of memories, a pinch of tobacco for offering, and went out the back door to her favorite place, beneath the great big fir tree. She placed the tobacco at its base and tucked her bag inside its roots. Dear grandfather tree, please keep my memories and my family safe. I will be home in the spring. Echo, come inside now. It's time for you to go. When they rattled down the dirt road and into the trees, Echo held a sprig of fir close to her heart. Echo could not help herself. She looked at everything. Tall grass swaying to the rhythm of the breeze, determined mosquitoes, working bumblebees. She had memorized each shiny rock, the sand beneath her feet, crayfish and minnows and tadpoles that squirmed between her toes, all at the bottom of the creek. We know that residential schools had a huge impact on Aboriginal people in Canada and around the world as well as the loss of Aboriginal traditions, languages, and cultures. Residential schools were a traumatic experience for the victims and the survivors. Nicola Campbell writes, the effects of the residential school continue to permeate people today. It is said that it will take 7 generations for our people to heal. And this leads us to a discussion of trauma and intergenerational trauma, which we will talk about next. Colonialism is now recognized as one of the unique social determinants of health for Aboriginal people, and there is now considerable evidence that intergenerational trauma is an important factor in the poor health status of Aboriginal communities in Canada. Understanding intergenerational trauma requires an understanding of trauma. Trauma is defined as the actual or perceived threat of death, serious injury or harm, or learning that this has happened to a loved one. We know that trauma is a stressor because it elicits the physiological stress response. We know that traumatic events take an enormous toll on survivors and that the effect of trauma can last for decades. Examples of trauma at the personal level are accidents, abuse, or imprisonment, whereas examples of trauma at the community or collective level would be war or genocide. We know that the scars of trauma are often invisible, and research now shows that the effects of trauma can be passed on to children and grandchildren. For victims of trauma, non-traumatic stressors such as unemployment or financial problems can have an additive effect on the health of the person. We also know that the impact of cultural or collective trauma can be profound. When we look at the impact of trauma on families, we see parenting deficits, social disadvantage that is not often regained. The prolonged experience of trauma, such as residential school, where many children spend many years, means that victims experience stress and the stress response over an extended period of time. And this leads to a physiological vulnerability to physical and mental illness. The kinds of mental health issues that we see in trauma survivors include depression, substance use abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, and difficulty with coping. We also need to keep in mind that current health and social conditions, as well as discrimination, serve as a reminder of the historical trauma and become a source of new trauma. When we look at intergenerational trauma, one of the things that have been studied is the effect of the stories of survivors on the children. Growing up in a household with survivors, children remember narratives and images, and these can become a traumatic memory or experience in their own right. Not all survivors want to talk about what happened to them. And so even though the experience at the residential school may not be talked about, and there is an impact of silence, trauma is still present in the home, and it has an impact on the family. As nurses, we understand that early childhood experience has a profound impact on health, and that adverse childhood experiences such as abuse, neglect, and household substance use can negatively affect the health of the adult. Statistically, adult children of residential school survivors experience higher levels of poverty and unemployment. They witness more traumatic events, experience more violence, assault, and discrimination. Now I'd like to play for you a short 5-minute piece from the CBC radio archives. These interviews are some of the residential school survivors from a small community in northern Canada following a series of youth suicides. The piece is called Abuse Affects the Next Generation.
Last night on The World at 6, we heard about the suicide epidemic in Native communities in northwestern Ontario. These communities have the highest suicide rate in the country, almost 7 times the national average. The victims are usually young, many still in their teens. Parents are struggling to explain why their children are killing themselves. Many point to their own past, to the residential schools that had to substitute for a family. They say they'll always bear the emotional scars of those early days, and they worry their trauma has been passed on to another generation. Colin Rooney reports.
The sound of the train always takes Corinne Navigon back to her childhood. Her mixed memories about the days when her family took the train to their trap line. They lived in a tent where she learned how to hunt and fish. Then one year the police showed up. They told her parents she had to go to school. She was 6 years old. So Navigon's parents took her on the train to Thunder Bay. They left her at St. Joseph's Residential School. It became her prison and the beginning of her personal hell.
I remember that door shutting, and it just, all of a sudden, it was just fear. My parents were gone, and we were alone, and I remember it just feeling like I was going to a jail. That's how I felt, like I was going to be locked up in this place, and that's exactly how it turned out to be.
Like all the others who went to residential school, she was given a number. It was stamped on all her belongings. She was never again called by name. Her long braids were cut off. Once she was beaten for speaking Ojibwe instead of English. The nuns at the school preached kindness, but she says they practiced cruelty.
There's nobody there to lecture you, or to hold you or whatever. And, or if you got hurt, there's nobody there to help you right through that pain. So you suffered a lot of loneliness, like hours of loneliness.
When Navagon grew up and had her own children, she had problems showing her love because she never got any.
But when you got around that age, around 6, around that age, I couldn't give them that nurturing, that they needed, because I never had that kind of nurturing. More like the holding and the closeness and that kind of thing. It wasn't there. I had to force myself.
Garnet Antikinov says it's no wonder these parents can't cope. He went to residential school too. Now he works for some of the reserves where the suicides are happening. He says all the students he knew were abused in some way.
Because of that, what we're seeing today is a generation, more than one generation, there's several generations involved here of people that really can't function as parents. People who've been scarred by the various abuses of the residential school are still dealing with these scars, and they're dealing with them in a very negative way. It's no wonder I see some of those people that really can't cope with life.
Antikinov says now it's their children who aren't coping with life. That's why they're drinking, sniffing gas, and committing suicide. He wonders when it will stop.
I hope it stops soon. But, the problems will just keep going until there's a proper healing process. And so I have the churches involved, the federal government involved, and until people deal with their deep-rooted problems, the problem's not going to go away.
St. Joseph's School is no longer here. It was torn down years ago to make a playground. Corinne Navagon is 50 years old now, but she still isn't over the experience.
I have twice had a complete breakdown, and I really feel that experience played a major part. Like that abuse it just takes a chunk out of you.
Navagon still struggles with depression, but she's found help by going back to native religion and traditional ways.
I usually go out in the bush, I go by myself, or I go by the water. So I find I get nurtured that way. And that's the only way that I survived when I was in the boarding school. With that go out to sit by the tree and let the sun, heal me.
Navagon says she's faced what happened to her in the residential schools, and that's what the native communities in the north have to do. The people have to talk about the abuse and what it's now doing to their children. Colleen Green, CBC News, Thunder Bay.
So with Prime Minister Harper's apology in 2008, there was an increased awareness in the general public of the harm caused by residential schools in Canada. However, colonial attitudes remain deeply ingrained in individuals and organizations, and Aboriginal people still experience a lot of discrimination and racism, and this is in their interactions with healthcare professionals as well. So the next step in cultural safety education is self-reflection and examination of nursing practice. In this step of cultural safety education, we examine how our own attitudes can reflect colonial perspectives and influence our nursing practice without us even being aware of it. So I will unpack two common statements that we hear often in healthcare that reflect some of these colonial attitudes. To give you an example of what I'm talking about. This first statement, I treat everyone equally, makes some important assumptions. First assumption is that everyone has equal opportunity and free choice. The second is that racism doesn't exist in healthcare. And the third is that we are all the same. Statistics show us, however, that the burden of inequity in socioeconomic status and health is disproportionately borne by a racialized community, and that Aboriginal people do experience discrimination and prejudice in healthcare. For many people, the experience of discrimination can make them reluctant to access healthcare. And the truth is, we aren't all the same. Some of us are born into privilege, and some of us are born into poverty. We have to keep in mind that we perpetuate inequity by avoiding the subject of racism. And a statement like this, that I treat everyone equally, denies that racism doesn't exist. The second statement, Aboriginal people would be better off or have better health if they made better lifestyle choices. This statement reflects the assumption that the poor health of Aboriginal communities is due to poor lifestyle choices, and that health is the result of good lifestyle choices alone. The truth is that research on the social determinants of health clearly demonstrates that social inequity is a profound mediator of poor health. And we know that Aboriginal communities were healthy societies pre-contact with settler communities, and that the poverty and poor health of many Aboriginal communities is a direct result of colonial practices such as the residential school system. The issue behind this statement is that it is the rhetoric of equality and individual responsibility that can blind us as healthcare professionals to our own privilege and our own power. Our goal in cultural safety is improved health outcomes. And by improving the quality of how we provide nursing care to our clients, cultural safety can lead us to go to the next step and participate in change. Aboriginal people widely report that they experience healthcare services in Canada as culturally unsafe, and we want to change that. Participating in change is especially important for those of us who are not of Aboriginal ancestry. And we can be guided by this enhanced empathy towards advocacy and social justice work on behalf of our clients and communities. To participate in change, we can work on an organizational level, and as community health nurses, we can approach staff and leadership positions and ask them about providing cultural safety education for staff. Local Aboriginal leaders and elders can provide leadership in this regard, and collaborating with Aboriginal communities will help to ensure that what we're doing is on track. When I examine cultural safety, I believe that at its core, it's about healing and building relationships. When we recognize that colonial attitudes created historical practices like the residential school system, and that colonial attitudes continue to inform discriminatory behavior today, we can see that colonial attitudes are acted out in relationships. And in relationships, produces relationships with an unequal balance of power. So because colonial attitudes are acted out in relationships, these issues that we're talking about between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, these issues are relational. And as community health nurses, we know how important relationships are. The interesting thing is how in this discussion of relationship, we find that relationship is so important and of central importance in Aboriginal cultures. So that while Indigenous worldviews vary greatly across the globe and from community to community, all of them found to have important elements in common, especially the primacy of relationship in Indigenous lives and culture. Other concepts important in Indigenous cultures include holism, responsibility, and balance, and these concepts intersect with relationship, creating a robust understanding of relationality that is uncommon in our Western understanding. A holistic view of relationships extends the concept of relationship beyond those between people and community to involve relationships with the land, relationships with nature, and with the cosmos. Accountability to relationships is also a robust notion in that it implies accountability to the community, to the ancestors, and to nature as well. To give you an example of this, Aboriginal scholar Gregory Kahigi tells us that traditionally Indigenous people believed that the natural universe was alive and sacred, and that they had relationships with and responsibilities to the land and all living things. He writes of the perception among some Indian herbalists that plants are the hairs of Mother Earth. Every time you pull a plant from the earth, she feels that pull, and you must always make the proper offering of tobacco and prayers so that it doesn't hurt her too much. You can see in this little quote from Kahigi that respect guides these understandings of relationship and is reflected in relationships with all of creation. A robust understanding of respect in relationship includes these relational attributes such as listening intently, kindness, courtesy, considering the well-being of others, and respect for the interconnectedness of all living things. And this primacy of relationship in Aboriginal cultures really does intersect nicely with concepts about relational practice in nursing. Aboriginal scholars tell us that providing healthcare for Aboriginal people should reflect this respect for relationship. Several authors in nursing have looked to models of relational practice and found that not only do they describe a variety of relational characteristics that reflect these humanistic values, but they also articulate well the holistic understanding of relationship in Aboriginal communities. So in these examples, the nurse, or in these models of relational practice, the nurse or caregiver is fully present, attentive, dialogue is reciprocal, so there's a mutuality happening, and the nurse-patient relationship is viewed as a partnership. Also, listening to client stories is valued. Complexity and ambiguity are accepted and honored. And respect, mindfulness, and authenticity are regarded as important relational skills that can enhance well-being. Looking at these dimensions of relational practice, we can see how they reflect important aspects of cultural safety, such as respect, partnership, and listening to client stories. Michael DeGagne, the executive director of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, describes how important listening to client stories is to establishing cultural safety. Because listening to client stories helps to affirm identities which have been forcibly suppressed in the residential school system. For many Aboriginal clients, this can be one of the first steps in their healing journey. So a person actually being able to tell their story and having someone listen to it with attention can be one of the first steps in the healing journey. As an educator, some of my students have felt helpless in the face of the challenges and trauma experienced by some of their Aboriginal clients. And they aren't always aware of the value of simply listening to client stories. I think it is a really fine example of relational practice when we listen to client stories. And I think students and nurses need to know that it is important just to listen. I would add that being comfortable with silence and building trust are also important relational qualities. That brings me to the end of my presentation on cultural safety and working with Aboriginal people and communities. I hope that I've been able to take you on a nice journey through an exploration of cultural safety education and help you make those connections between the importance of relationship relational practice, cultural safety, and an awareness of colonial practices such as the residential school system and the effect of trauma and intergenerational trauma on Aboriginal communities. I would like to thank you for joining me today, and I encourage you to email me if you have any questions or comments about today's webinar. And I'd like to let you know too that if you've participated in a monthly seminar by OTN or a live webcast or archive webcast, you are eligible to receive a certificate. Just follow the link below, complete the survey, and you will get your certificate. Thank you, and